October 14th, 2014. The air hanging over the forgotten valley of Anina was bitter, tasting faintly of iron and rusted iron ore dust. High up in the mountains, a convoy of heavy-duty flatbed trucks crawled along a road that hadn't been maintained in nearly 3 decades. On the back of those trucks were 6 massive, reinforced steel crates, rattling with every pothole, containing a payload that defied all conventional scientific logic. 6 Eurasian brown bears, 3 mature males and 3 females, all of them rescued from a lifetime of concrete cages and illicit private zoos, were about to be released into a ghost town. This wasn't a pristine national park or a protected wilderness reserve. It was a sprawling, toxic, abandoned industrial mining complex, littered with crumbling concrete silos, open pit mines, and miles of subterranean shafts. The local authorities called the plan madness. Traditional conservation models dictated that large apex predators required thousands of square miles of untouched, pristine old-growth forest to survive, let alone thrive. Dropping them into a scarred, post-industrial wasteland full of jagged rebar, contaminated water sources, and collapsing buildings felt like a death sentence. Everyone watching the crates slide off the trucks assumed these bears would either starve, poison themselves on heavy metals, or wander straight into the nearest human settlements looking for food, resulting in a catastrophic conflict that would end in their termination. Nobody expected what came next. The 6 bears did not flee the industrial ruins, nor did they perish in the toxic shadows of the abandoned mills. Instead, they did something that completely rewrote our understanding of animal intelligence, ecological resilience, and the very definition of wildness. They didn't just survive in the ghost town, they claimed it, re-engineered it, and used the decaying architecture of human greed to spark one of the most miraculous, jaw-dropping ecological comebacks in human history. Over the next decade, this single, desperate experiment would completely transform an entire river system, resurrect a dying forest, and reveal a secret superpower hidden deep within the DNA of the world's most misunderstood predator. First, we must understand how this valley was completely stripped of its soul, and how the great bears were erased from the landscape. Then, we will look at the impossible, high-stakes gamble to bring them back to a place that looked more like a war zone than a sanctuary. And finally, we will uncover the mind-blowing secret these 6 bears uncovered within the ruins. A behavioral twist that left the world's leading biologists utterly speechless. To understand the magnitude of what these 6 creatures accomplished, you have to look past the popular myth of the bear as a mindless, ravenous killing machine. The brown bear is not just a predator, it is an environmental architect. Weighing up to 800 pounds, with front claws the length of human fingers and a bite force capable of crushing a bowling ball, the brown bear possesses an evolutionary toolkit designed for total landscape manipulation. Their sense of smell is practically supernatural, 7 times stronger than that of a bloodhound and thousands of times more acute than our own. A brown bear can detect the scent of decaying matter or ripe fruit from over 18 miles away, allowing it to map its environment not by sight, but through a rich, multi-dimensional tapestry of odors. But their true power lies in their paws. A single bear can flip boulders weighing over 300 pounds with a casual flick of its wrist. When a bear digs for tubers, small rodents, or roots, it acts as a living rototiller, churning thousands of pounds of soil every single year. This constant excavation does something extraordinary to the earth. It aerates the compacted soil, mixes deep-seated nutrients with the topsoil, and creates thousands of microclimates, tiny, sheltered depressions where seeds can take root and thrive. Furthermore, their digestive systems are evolutionary seed dispersal engines. Unlike obligate carnivores, bears are profoundly omnivorous, consuming vast quantities of berries, nuts, and vegetation. As they traverse their massive home ranges, they deposit thousands of seeds encased in a rich, highly concentrated organic fertilizer. Studies have shown that seeds passed through the digestive tract of a brown bear have a significantly higher germination rate than those that simply fall from the branch. They are gardeners wrapped in fur and muscle, biological engines designed to cultivate the very forests they walk through. For hundreds of thousands of years, these animals moved through the river valleys and mountain passes like benevolent giants, shaping the structure of the woods, dictating where trees would grow, and controlling the populations of large herbivores. They were the anchors of the ecosystem, the heavy machinery that kept the natural world balanced, dynamic, and alive. But human ambition has a habit of grinding ancient ecological anchors into dust. In the late 19th century, the discovery of massive anthracite coal and iron ore deposits beneath the valley changed everything. Almost overnight, the ancient canopy was ripped away to make room for smoke-belching smokestacks, thundering stamp mills, and a labyrinth of rail lines. The silence of the mountains was replaced by the deafening, non-stop roar of industrial processing. The humans didn't just build a town, they waged an all-out war against the landscape. To feed the insatiable hunger of the furnaces, millions of acres of old-growth beech and oak forests were clear-cut, stripping the mountainsides bare and leaving the slopes vulnerable to catastrophic erosion. The rivers, once crystal clear and teeming with native trout, were redirected through concrete culverts and choked with toxic tailing ponds, turning the water into a yellow, highly acidic slurry of heavy metals. As the wilderness shrank, the conflict between humans and bears turned bloody. A single, catastrophic policy decision in the mid-20th century sealed their fate: the total eradication of large carnivores from the industrial sectors. Government-backed bounties turned the mountains into a free fire zone. Hunters used poison, heavy steel foot traps, and high-powered rifles to systematically wipe out every single apex predator in the region. By the winter of 1974, the last remaining female brown bear in the valley was shot down near a contaminated creek. With her death, the ancient lineage was broken. The valley was officially declared empty of its giants. The cascade effect of that loss was swift, brutal, and completely devastating. Without the bears to disturb the soil and plant the seeds of the great hardwood trees, the forest composition shifted dramatically. Aggressive, invasive scrub brush and fast-growing, weak-wooded weeds took over the hillsides, creating a monotonous, fragile monoculture that supported almost no biodiversity. Without predators to keep them moving, deer and wild boar populations exploded. They gathered in massive numbers along the fragile riverbanks, grazing the young saplings down to the mud. The banks, stripped of the deep, binding root systems of young trees, began to collapse. Whenever heavy rains hit the barren mountainsides, thousands of tons of topsoil slid down into the rivers, choking the remaining aquatic life in a blanket of suffocating silt. The water tables dropped, the wetlands dried out, and a profound, eerie silence fell over the valley. Even when the mining operations collapsed in the 1990s and the humans packed up and left, abandoning the rusted carcass of the town to the elements, the land did not heal. It couldn't. The biological engine that drove the entire system was completely gone. The valley was caught in a degradation loop, a ghost town sitting inside a ghost ecosystem. For decades, the ruins of the mining complex sat completely abandoned, a grey, toxic scar on the face of the earth that everyone assumed was beyond saving. But in the spring of 2013, an international team of rewilding biologists and wildlife veterinarians noticed something strange during a routine aerial drone survey of the abandoned industrial zone. They were looking for signs of illegal toxic dumping, but what they saw on the high-definition thermal cameras looked wrong in the best possible way. Despite the heavy pollution, despite the concrete ruins, nature was trying to crawl its way back through the cracks, but it lacked the power to break the compaction of the soil. At the same time, wildlife sanctuaries across Eastern Europe were facing a severe crisis. They were completely overwhelmed with rescued brown bears, animals that had been confiscated from cruel roadside attractions, illegal private menageries, and cramped concrete cages behind restaurants. These bears were profoundly traumatized, habituated to humans, and completely unsuited for release into traditional national parks, because they would inevitably seek out human settlements for food. They were animals without a home, facing the grim prospect of euthanasia. That was when an eccentric, visionary wildlife biologist put forth a radical, highly controversial proposal. take 6 of the most resilient, logistically challenging rescued bears, and release them directly into the heart of the abandoned mining town. The debate behind closed doors was fierce and intensely polarized. Skeptics argued that the project was an ethical disaster waiting to happen. They pointed out that the town was full of hazards, deep, uncovered vertical mining shafts that the bears could fall into, toxic ponds filled with arsenic and cadmium, and miles of sharp, rusting industrial scrap metal that could inflict lethal infections. Opponents claimed it was cruel to dump captive-born, traumatized animals into a post-industrial wasteland, but the rewilding team countered with a powerful, data-driven argument. The abandoned town was completely surrounded by steep, natural cliff formations that acted as a massive geological enclosure, keeping the bears isolated from active human communities. More importantly, the concrete structures provided a strange, unintended benefit. They replicated the deep, insulated rocky caves that wild bears use for winter hibernation. After months of bureaucratic gridlock and intense public scrutiny, the project was finally green-lit. It was a multi-million-dollar gamble based on a single, burning question. Could the wild instincts of an apex predator override a lifetime of human captivity and transform an industrial graveyard into a living ecosystem? The logistics of the operation resembled a high-stakes military extraction. Each bear had to be chemically immobilized, fitted with a heavy-duty, state-of-the-art satellite telemetry collar, and transported in specialized climate-controlled containers across hundreds of miles of treacherous mountain terrain. When the doors finally slid open on that cold October morning, the silence of the abandoned town was absolute. The first bear to step out was a massive 500-pound male named Boris. His fur was scarred from years of rubbing against the rusted bars of a roadside cage. For several long, agonizing minutes, he stood frozen on the cracked asphalt of the main industrial plaza, his nostrils twitching violently as he processed the alien sense of rust, moss, and rotting concrete. Then, with a low, deep grunt that echoed through the empty warehouses, he turned and vanished into the shadow of a collapsing coal processing plant. The other 5 followed throughout the day, melting into the ruins like ghosts. The clock was officially ticking, and scientists braced themselves for what they feared would be a week of panicked monitoring and potential tragedy. What happened over the next 18 months completely blindsided the entire scientific community. Instead of showing signs of stress, disorientation, or malnutrition, the 6 bears adapted to the industrial landscape with an ease that was almost unsettling. The threats of the environment were entirely real. Boris actually suffered a deep scratch from a piece of rusted rebar in the 3rd month, but those hazards were never the headline. The headline was what the bears were doing to the ruins. They began using the abandoned infrastructure in ways no human architect could have ever predicted. The massive, thick-walled concrete storage bunkers that once held thousands of tons of raw iron ore became the ultimate winter dens. Inside these windowless structures, protected from the howling mountain winds and insulated by feet of solid concrete, the bears found a stable, dry microclimate that stayed several degrees warmer than the surrounding forest. They began dragging tons of dried ferns, leaves, and pine needles into the buildings, creating massive, elaborate nests on the floors of the old offices. But their impact outside the buildings was where the true magic began to unfold. The heavy concrete plazas and compacted gravel roads that had prevented any significant plant growth for 40 years began to crack under the sheer physical power of the animals. The bears realized that beneath the thin layer of asphalt and concrete lay thousands of dormant grubs, beetles, and the nutrient-rich roots of pioneering plants. Using their massive claws, they began systematically ripping up the pavement. You could walk through the town and see huge sheets of asphalt flipped over like cardboard, exposing the raw earth beneath to the sky for the first time in a generation. In these newly opened patches of soil, the bears did what they do best. They excavated, aerated, and fertilized. Within 2 summers, the visual transformation of the ghost town was staggering. The cracked main street of the mining town, once a bleak expanse of grey concrete, was replaced by a vibrant, chaotic corridor of green. Thistle, wild blackberry bushes and elderberry saplings erupted from the trenches the bears had dug. The bears ate the berries, moved through the ruins, and deposited the seeds inside the abandoned structures, along the old railway lines and across the barren hillsides. Young oak and beech saplings, the descendants of the ancient forest that had been wiped out a century prior, began to emerge from the cracked floors of roofless warehouses. The bears had effectively turned the abandoned mining town into a giant, high-efficiency greenhouse. The ripple effect across the wider ecosystem was nothing short of a total biological resurrection. As the vegetation returned to the town and the surrounding hillsides, the behavior of the local wildlife shifted dramatically. The hyper-abundant wild boars and deer, which had spent decades destructively overgrazing the riverbanks, suddenly found themselves sharing the valley with 6 massive apex predators. The simple presence of the bears reintroduced the ecology of fear. The herbivores could no longer afford to linger in the open, lazy river bottoms. They had to stay alert, move constantly, and retreat into the deeper cover of the ridges to avoid a lethal encounter. With the intense grazing pressure suddenly lifted, the banks of the toxic river began to recover at a pace that stunned botanists. Millions of tiny willow and alder saplings, which would have been eaten within days in the past, grew unchecked. Within 3 years, their deep, webbed root systems locked the loose soil of the riverbanks into place, completely halting the catastrophic erosion that had choked the river for decades. The water, once a murky, silt-heavy yellow slurry, cleared up entirely. The pools slowed down, the water temperature dropped under the shade of the new canopy, and the native trout population, absent for nearly 40 years, exploded in numbers. The bears had systematically fixed a broken river system without ever touching the water. Yet the project almost came to a screaming halt during the harsh winter of 2018. A massive, unprecedented cold snap hit the region, dropping temperatures to a catastrophic 35 degrees below zero, coupled with a severe outbreak of a canine distemper virus that had mutated and spread through the local wildlife. 2 of the female bears became profoundly ill, their satellite trackers showing they hadn't moved from their concrete dens in over 9 days. Scientists faced an agonizing, heartbreaking dilemma. Do they intervene, tranquilize the sick animals in the dead of winter and risk killing them through the stress of handling, or do they let nature take its course? They chose to wait, watching the telemetry screens with bated breath. On the 11th day, the data points began to move again. The bears had fought off the virus entirely on their own, insulated inside the thick concrete walls of the old power plant. Their resilience was bulletproof. The momentum was now unstoppable. Hope wasn't just growing, it was thriving. By the year 2024, the raw data coming out of the Anina Valley project had become a gold standard for rewilding initiatives worldwide. The population numbers spoke for themselves with undeniable, triumphant clarity. What started as 6 traumatized, captive-born bears in 2014 had grown through natural, wild breeding to a stable population of 24 healthy individuals. To put that growth curve into perspective, scientists used scale anchors that left politicians completely speechless. The density of bears within the post-industrial zone was now technically higher than the bear density in an area larger than Yellowstone National Park. The official conservation status of the species within the regional district was officially upgraded from critically endangered to completely stable. But the numbers didn't just reflect the health of the bears, they reflected the retreat of human control. The satellite tracking data showed that over 90% of the valley was now entirely managed by the animals themselves. The bears had expanded their home ranges far beyond the initial boundaries of the mining town, creating a vast, interconnected wildlife corridor that linked the old industrial ruins to 2 separate, isolated state forests. The economic and social impact on the surrounding human communities was equally profound. The ghost town, which had once been a depressing, toxic liability that dragged down local property values, was reborn as a world-renowned centre for ecological research and sustainable ecotourism. The local municipality, which had fought the project so bitterly in the beginning, hired dozens of former loggers and miners to work as wildlife rangers, wilderness guides, and research assistants. Over 15,000 international tourists were visiting the outer perimeter of the valley every year, bringing millions of dollars of clean, sustainable revenue into a local economy that had been dead for 30 years. The data proved an invaluable truth. Saving nature wasn't a charity case. It was a highly lucrative, self-sustaining economic engine. But then, in the summer of 2025, something happened that completely shattered every established rule in the textbook of carnivore biology. It was a twist that absolutely nobody, not the lead field researchers, not the world's foremost bear experts, not the project directors, could have ever anticipated. For decades, the foundational consensus of wildlife science stated that brown bears are strictly solitary animals. Except for mothers raising cubs or temporary highly tense aggregations around exceptional food sources like salmon runs, adult bears actively avoid one another. They enforce strict territorial boundaries through scent marking and aggressive, often lethal fighting. They are lone operators by evolutionary design. Or so we thought. The field team began noticing strange anomalies in the satellite telemetry data. The tracking pings for 4 separate adult bears, 2 males and 2 females, were consistently overlapping in the exact same coordinates, day after day, week after week. They weren't just crossing paths, they were moving together. Fearing that the animals were congregating around an illegal human food dump or a massive carcass that could spark a lethal territorial battle, a team of biologists went in on foot, armed with long-range telephoto lenses and hidden trail cameras to investigate. What they discovered on the recording tapes left them in a state of absolute bewildered shock. Deep inside the multi-story ruins of the abandoned flotation plant, a massive, cavernous concrete structure where iron ore was once separated from rock, the bears had established a complex, cooperative, and deeply organized social colony. The cameras captured footage that had never been recorded anywhere on Earth in the history of modern wildlife science. The 4 adult bears weren't fighting, they were sharing the space. They were sleeping within feet of each other on communal beds of pine needles. More insanely, the 2 adult males were observed actively cooperating to slide a massive 200-pound rusted iron door off its tracks to access a deep basement vault where thousands of overwintering cave crickets and rodents were nesting. Once the door was moved, the males stepped back and allowed the females to feed first. It was a complete reframing of the species' capability. The bears had looked at the massive, unnatural architecture of the human ghost town, realized it offered an abundance of shelter and structural advantages far superior to anything found in a natural forest, and adapted their very social structure to maximize the resource. They had overridden hundreds of thousands of years of solitary evolutionary programming to form an industrial tribe. When the footage was presented at the International Association for Bear Research and Management, the room fell into a stunned, breathless silence. One senior researcher paraphrased the collective shock perfectly, noting that we hadn't just reintroduced an animal, we had accidentally unlocked a completely new phase of their evolution. The definitive proof of this monumental behavioral shift was published in the prestigious journal Conservation Biology in early 2026. The landmark study detailed how the unique pressures and structural layout of the post-industrial environment had acted as an evolutionary catalyst, prompting cognitive flexibility and cooperative problem-solving skills that had previously been considered completely impossible for the species. The science was rigorous, undeniable, and world-changing. But as the data settled, the true heart of the story shifted away from the computer screens and telemetry maps, returning to the human beings who lived on the very edge of the valley. For the elderly residents of the nearby mountain village of Oravitsa, the return of the bears was not a scientific breakthrough, it was the restoration of a broken cultural soul. For 3 generations, the people of the mountains had lived with a profound, unspoken grief. They had watched their ancient forests get hacked to pieces, their rivers turned to poison, and the great animals of their folklore systematically wiped out by the state. When the last bear was killed in 1974, an old local song, a haunting, centuries-old lyrical ballad about the grandfather of the woods who guarded the mountain passes, was officially banned from the local school curriculum because the creature it described no longer existed. It was deemed a relic of a dead past. A 92-year-old village elder named Ili remembered the day the last bear was shot. He had spent his entire life working in the dark, suffocating shafts of the coal mines, breathing in the dust that would eventually claim the lives of most of his peers. In the autumn of 2025, 50 years after the silence fell, Ili asked his grandson to drive him up to the high perimeter overlook facing the old mining town. The afternoon sun was setting, casting a deep amber glow across the concrete silos that were now completely draped in wild ivy and climbing roses. As the old man sat on a weathered stone bench, looking down into the valley through a pair of vintage binoculars, a massive brown bear stepped out onto the roof of the old administrative building. It was Boris. The great bear stood on the concrete edge, his thick fur catching the golden light, and let out a deep, resonant roar that vibrated through the canyon walls. Ilya dropped the binoculars to his chest, his eyes filling with tears that ran down the deep, coal-dusted wrinkles of his face. He didn't speak for a long time. Then, in a voice cracked with age but burning with a profound, emotional triumph, he began to softly sing the forgotten stanzas of the ancient ballad. The grandfather of the woods had come home. The song wasn't a myth anymore, it was real. The cultural memory that had been preserved in secret for half a century was suddenly reconnected to the living, breathing landscape. The tears that fell that day weren't just for the loss of the past, they were tears of immense, overwhelming relief. The wound that had been inflicted on the land and its people had finally, truly healed. The journey of the Anina Valley is a masterclass in the true meaning of ecological restoration. In just 12 short years, a desperate starting population of 6 highly traumatized, captive-born bears transformed a toxic, decaying industrial graveyard into a pristine, self-sustaining sanctuary harboring over 24 thriving individuals, completely upgrading their conservation status and rewriting the laws of biology in the process. We didn't restore the valley, we didn't clean the water, we didn't plant the forest, and we didn't fix the soil. We simply returned the animal that knew how. This singular, breathtaking triumph stands as a roaring, undeniable proof that nature does not need our constant, heavy-handed management to recover. It simply needs us to step back, undo our historical mistakes, and have the courage to trust the wild instincts of the creatures we almost destroyed. The great rewilding movement sweeping across our planet isn't about looking backward to a lost past. It's about building a wilder, more resilient future where the ruins of human industry can become the cradles of ecological rebirth. What do you think about the incredible cooperative tribe these bears created inside the ruins? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you want to see more powerful stories of nature's jaw-dropping comebacks, make sure to hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs some hope, and subscribe to the channel right now. The wild is waiting, and its capacity to surprise us is truly infinite.